Hello there, good evening. Welcome both the audience in real space and also our audience in digital space, online, via Facebook Live and YouTube. So good evening, welcome to the third of our public discussions on a series called Culture Tensions, which is programmed by the Ujazdowski Castle Centre for Contemporary Art. Thank you to them. Myself and my co-curator, Agnieszka Kolek, have put this season on, this programme, for the year, for 2022. So this is the third of our debates. And when we put this on, or programmed these ideas, suddenly the world's changed in 2022. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which we touched on in our last debate on the sacred and the profane. And with this conversation, a woman's right to choose, only 2 weeks or maybe less so, the Supreme Court's leak of the possible overturning of the Roe versus Wade case, which legalized abortion in the USA at a federal level, allowing a woman to privately make that decision for herself whether she wanted to have a termination abortion or not. So very spookily prescient in many ways, but it's ripe for public discussion and public debate. A woman's right to choose. Obviously, you all know that Poland has particular laws which restricts the right to a woman to have an abortion. And it's not the only country. There are many other countries across the world, in Europe and beyond, where it is very restrictive and possibly illegal. But we also want to kind of move beyond the polarized conversations or fiery culture wars, whether one is pro-choice or pro-life. And obviously we see the extremes of those positions particularly played out in the USA, but also in Europe, and look for something that is a bit more nuanced. I think we will have disagreement, but it will be through civil debates rather than at each other's throats. I would like to really introduce our speakers because they have a lot to say, and 2 hours may not be enough, but also I want you, the audience, to also contribute to the discussion. So I'm going to introduce my speakers. Our guests are Ella Whelan, who's on my left here, Claudia Clare on my far left, and then Nina Power and Agnieszka Kolek. So just to give you a quick background on all our speakers, Ella, firstly, she's a freelance journalist and commentator and a writer. She published a book called What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. She's also the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which I'm delighted to announce is one of our partners on this program of debates. For those who don't know, the Battle of Ideas is an annual festival of public debates which holds free speech at its core. That's its kind of byline, freedom to speak and not be afraid to speak. She's also the commissioning editor of a fantastic series of pamphlets called Letters on Liberty. They're available online as well as in physical publication. And that really does revive a radical history of pamphleteering and putting forward, quite polemical but easily kind of accessible ideas in both the social and political and cultural sphere. She's a columnist and writes for Spiked online regularly, as well as The Critic and The Telegraph. Ella's appeared many times on TV and radio, which is great to see, on various public debating programs like BBC's Question Time, Today, Sky News, The Moral Maze, and so forth. She is also one half of a production company, a film production company called Lobster Films. And Lobster Films makes political documentaries about thorny issues, such as this one, and that many other media production companies may shy away from. Their first documentary was called The F Word, and it's online on YouTube. Next, Claudia Clare. Claudia is a fantastic painter, and she trained as a painter in the 80s. And then before becoming a ceramicist, so her medium is ceramic pottery, and that's one of the details that we've been very delighted to use as part of our advertising. She came very much from a traditional apprenticeship in the early 90s, but then she moved on to a PhD in 2007. The subject is called Shattered, and it was her first significant work and exhibition that explored how ceramics might be used to communicate women's stories of surviving sexual violence. In 2019, a major Arts Council-funded project with Women at the Well prompted a growing interest in social and performance collaborations with feminists and community organizations, mainly working with survivors of the sex trade. She's also involved with a campaign to decriminalize all prostituted persons and get their convictions removed from the police national record. She's the author of a very important book called Subversive Ceramics, which was published in 2016 with another equally well-known ceramicist, Edmund de Waal, who co-authored the Potts book in 2011. Next, Nina Power. So Nina is a writer and philosopher. She's written regularly for the Telegraph, Art Review, The Spectator, and many other arts magazines and publications. She's the author of One-Dimensional Woman, which was published in 2009. The New Statesman described it as a joy to read, and as well as her kind of non-fiction work, she has published a confessional essay poem, a very experimental piece of writing called Platforms, which I recommend. It's very readable and very stream of consciousness. Her latest book, which is here, just came out in about 2 months ago, I think, called What Do Men Want? I think a good compliment to What Do Women Want by Ella Whelan. So maybe the two books can battle it out. What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents. It was praised by the Times newspaper as a refreshingly sympathetic view of men and masculinity. And also very recently, Nina's been appointed as senior editor for a new New York-based cultural online magazine called Compact. So she just started that job, and do look out for that publication. It's brand new, and it focuses a lot on some of the similar issues that we talk about, where art and culture and politics meets. Then there's Agnieszka. Agnieszka, who you have seen previous debates here. She's an artist, curator, and co-founder of the Passion for Freedom Art Festival, which is our other organizational partner, and we're delighted to have them as a partner. Through supporting artists via the Passion for Freedom Festival, most of the artists that have been exhibiting there have been forbidden in either other countries or by curators. Agnieszka exposes the silence of many and challenges the comfortable position of those who inhabit safe spaces. Agnieszka survived a horrific terror attack that occurred in Copenhagen in 2015. But she continues the meeting regardless of the attack. Again, a free speech champion and freedom fighter, she said that they don't only want to kill us, they want to stop us talking, so we should continue the conversation. So I'm really delighted, as the only male on this panel, to have 4 amazing women to talk about a woman's right to choose. So our first speaker is going to be Agnieszka, who co-curates this program.
Right, so my main part would be to open up and in a sense, open up the space for this conversation, because I think it's important to go beyond the black and white. And it seems to me this kind of a fight that it's set up between the social media sphere, sensationalism, and quite often removed for various aspects that might bring things more into sharper focus, or more to a specific environment where there might be specific conditions. So one of the things I wanted to first touch upon is the sphere of art and artists, because it seems that it's a very limited space at the moment, that it would be more often that we would see art that is presenting one side of a view. And it was quite interesting when myself and Manick were looking for images of art, looking at the right to choose, but not only the right to choose to have abortion, but actually also the right to choose to have a baby, to have a child, also in difficult circumstances or any circumstances, and also looking at the historical aspect of that. So it was quite difficult to find variety of artworks, because it seems there is only one narrative, or at least it's a very limited narrative, and also that it's quite streamlined through how the public institutions are funded, and also how we seem to be conditioned by the environment. So it would be more often we see certain examples in the movies or in the cultural sphere, and then the wider variety of images and options. So it was interesting as well that, for example, the artwork we referred to, the artwork by Damien Hirst, when it was criticized on Facebook, I found it quite amusing that the critical voices were finding difficult where to grasp at the criticism of the artwork, and why we posted it to introduce the subject. So I found it quite interesting that it was more related to whether we have a permission to post a link to an article about the artwork, that actually it was commissioned and it was shown. And it didn't look at the other aspects of the issue, how the artwork is being financed, whether it's ethical that it's being financed by Qatar or not, and why in Qatar it's more controversial to show that the womb is actually is part of a woman, where you cannot show the female form, the nude. It's forbidden. So I found it quite interesting that in a sense, it showed me that the way things are already set, it's a mixture of things. So there is a mixture of how things are positioned in the public sphere, that there is only two options available and everything else in between doesn't exist. And even if you try to bring it up, you're being bungled up with one of these groups. And this is the way to shut you down. And the other side, that because of the social media, which actually seem to be more and more anti-social media, the attention span is very short, and also people are not able to go beyond just the headline, just the initial gut reaction of anger, or I like or I dislike, and I'm going to fight to death over it. So I'm interested in opening it up, and also I'm quite interested in taking it outside of the sphere of there is just the religious fundamentalist view, and then just the secular, and the secular is always for choice and abortion, where actually it's more complex, because it depends on the country, on the history of the country. It depends on whether there was ethnic cleansing involved to the nation or to the group of people. For example, thinking about the Yazidis, how they were supposed to be wiped out. And then how do they look at issues related to fertility, motherhood, and protecting their culture? So this is also something that I would be interested in. And then with the ideologies, it's quite often when we talk about the ideologies, there would be talk about that nationalists, they want to force women to have children, and this is how it is. Then we don't look at the Bolshevik ideas of trying to come into this sphere and make it public, in a sense that it's for the greater good of installing the only right system of communism and how it should look like, and what is the role then of the family is seen as a kind of a beginning of a bourgeoisie and it should be destroyed. So it's interesting that it would change depending on the ideology. The approach to that would change, and I don't see us in the public sphere exploring all these approaches through ideologies. Then with the Nazi Germany, where German Aryan women were forbidden to have abortions because they were supposed to have the children to build up this perfect nation. The disabled children were not allowed, and actually the first experiments how to kill on a massive scale were done on disabled people in the vans with the fumes. So, and then when they were invading the nation, then these women had wide access to abortions, and it was even encouraged. So I'm also interested in this nuance, look at that, how different regimes, ideologies look at that, and again, try to use it to their own ends. And in relation to the art, I just wanted to show a few artworks of an artist that contacted me. She's Polish, she was born in Zabrze in Poland. She graduated from the Academy of Fine Arts in Katowice, Poland. She majored in painting. She lives in Austria now. And we had a really interesting conversation because first of all, she said, this is a complex issue. It's not something that I could just say it's this way or that way. In a sense, you almost want to protect and allow for both of these positions to be able to function, which is obviously impossible. But the things that really touched me was that she was looking at the development of medicine, of biomedicine, of on one hand, how we are able to have interference with our bodies, with changing them, with our connection to our being. She herself had difficult experiences in life. She faced life and death at close range. She was pregnant in 2013. She learned of the genetic defect when she was 7 months pregnant. She gave birth and she had to say goodbye to the child because it wasn't able to survive. And the next year, her father died of heart attack. So she doesn't talk about these things lightly. But at the same time, she said it's a miracle of life. It's how there's continuity of passing the information through the genes. And it was interesting that she positioned that, in a sense, birth in itself is a bit like an act of anarchy because there's a new life coming in and it changes the order of things. And I found it quite fascinating, and I grappled with that, and I thought there is something to it where we have everything in order, and then it happens. And it is disruptive. And I don't think anyone is ever ready for that. So I found it quite interesting from the artistic point of view. And this is The Birth of Anarchy, one of her paintings. Can I do the next one? Sorry, I forgot I've got the clicker. So it's a series of her works where she explores the issues around birth, around also the difficulties. There is element of being just open to the experience. There is the danger as well. And also she's working now on the project in relation to genetics, and we talk about the gene editing and so on, because this subject also opens up to these issues where, let's say, we are at the stage talking about the quality of life and the state the child might be in when it's born, but then we will have to also try to discuss issues around ethics when the gene editing comes in, and other means of biological interference into humans' body. So I just wanted to open up a few boxes before we go deeper and all of our guests can state their position. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka and Manick and everyone who's been organising this today. I'm just really honoured to be here in Warsaw for the first time and to take part in such a daring set of debates, because it is true that abortion, rightly or wrongly, is still something that lots of people don't want to discuss or feel that they can't go there. So I'm delighted we've got to go there. I think abortion laws tell us a lot about how a society values women. And in the UK, where I'm from, abortion is, it's pretty accessible. In 1967, we passed a law which essentially meant that up until 24 weeks, most of us can access abortion services quite easily. There's not, certainly it's one of the more liberal countries in the world. But in order to be allowed that access and granted that service, women have to convince two doctors that they are either going mad, that they're suicidal, or that there is some imminent danger posed to their life in taking this pregnancy to term. In Poland, as people watching will know, the law is far more restrictive, with abortion only allowed in rare cases where a woman can prove that she was raped or a victim of a crime like incest. And I'm sure many people watched with horror the totally avoidable death of that woman Isabella, who died of sepsis after miscarrying at 22 weeks. But as a result of that death, the Polish government was pressured by thousands and thousands of protesters to change the law, who were calling for a much greater change than was allowed, and now permit women to access abortion if they believe their life to be in danger, which, I mean, how generous, you know. Anyway, small steps. Things, as Manick mentioned, things are looking bleak for access to abortion services across the world. The epitome of the free world, America, the place where freedom is supposed, we're told, is supposed to be born and bred and celebrated, has just released the news of the potential that the Supreme Court will overturn the 1973 court ruling, Roe versus Wade, which secured women's access to abortion unchallenged in the first trimester and under certain conditions up to 24 weeks. And that really could see abortion services all but disappear for something like 36 million women across America, with extremely punitive measures coming in, jail sentences of up to 10 years and things like that. Abortion has existed for centuries, and for centuries, there's this kind of idea that it's a sort of a modern invention. Obviously, things have gotten a hell of a lot better over the more recent years for women accessing abortion services, but it has been in place in some form or another, and women have practiced it for centuries. And indeed, it has been regulated and restricted for centuries. During his rule in 211 AD, the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus introduced, I think, perhaps one of the first abortion laws, which was that a woman could not have an abortion without the consent of her husband, because it would be seen to be denying him of an heir. And if that kind of makes you shocked or surprised, then how about the fact that up until very recently, in 2011, countries like Indonesia, Malawi, Japan, Taiwan, Turkey, all had laws on the statute books that did pretty much that, regulated abortion according to whether or not the woman had the consent of her male partner. So why am I telling you all of this? It can sometimes seem odd to people to think of abortion in terms of politics, something such a personal and highly morally loaded thing. After all, no woman has or wants an abortion for political reasons. We know that no pregnant woman wakes up and decides to have a procedure or take a pill on the basis of her views of women's rights, or to take a stand against women's freedom. Women simply have abortions because they don't want to be pregnant or they don't want to give birth. It's an intensely personal decision that no two situations are replicated or comparable. But while individual women's decisions might not immediately have political significance, their ability to make those decisions and the way in which societies they live in value their ability to make those decisions is inherently political. It is the politics of women's freedom. And that in many societies, from mine to yours and across the country, a woman has to convince or pretend that she will go mad, has to debase herself or be debased by some crime, by the actions of a man, or to have to play the victim in some form to be allowed to make a fundamental choice about her body is wrong. It's a political decision made by other people rather than by women. And in that sense, abortion and our approach to it, I think, really is the true test of how we value women in the 21st century. Abortion is all about choice. do you think that women should be free to make choices about their lives, to define their futures, to decide what's going to happen to them and their bodies, whether or not they're going to become mothers, whether or not they're going to raise children, and whether or not they're going to invite the anarchy of childbirth, the wonderful anarchy of children into their lives or not? Do you think they should be allowed to do that, or do you think they shouldn't? And in that way, abortion really is a binary choice, because you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't, and you can't have a sort of iffy abortion. Either you terminate it or you take it to term. The choice to become a parent, after all, and the choice to grow and give birth to what could eventually become another human being, is one of the most serious and awe-inspiring and wonderful decisions imaginable. For those of us who want to embark on that journey, it really is exciting and life-changing. But for those of us who, for one reason or another, are not ready, or don't want to, or have changed our mind, it simply is not an option. So let's think about this idea of choice. And there's a reason why pro-choice activists call themselves pro-choice, because this is not a pro-abortion, anti-abortion way of looking at it. I think that's a mistake. It really is a whether or not you have the choice to make that yes or no decision, or whether you're saying you don't have that choice. So thinking about that and the freedom to choose what path we take in life and to define our own histories, I wanted to think a little bit about agency and a woman's ability to make those choices, whether or not our access to reasoning and rationale is the same as men, which really is what it comes down to. Because we know that many women believe it isn't. We know many people believe that it isn't. For example, sexist men and feminist campaigners are alike these days, actually. Women are more in tune with their emotions. We're more in need of protection. We're not as capable of rational reasoning as men. We need to have that helping hand, or that step up, or that knight in shining armor. And I suppose I want to ask whether or not that stands in the way of this sense of women's agency, and whether or not we're able to make those decisions as freely and as easily as any man could. So in the short time I have left, I wanted to just look at some women throughout history, art history, who are proof, if you like, of the fact that yes, women have constantly pushed and strained against restrictions often imposed by men, and that we have always been capable of making the most serious and the most brave and inspiring decisions. So take Charlotte Salomon, displayed here. That's actually her on the left, and that's one of her self-portraits. A German Jewish artist born in Berlin in 1917, who for many reasons had an incredibly tragedy-strewn life. When she was just 8, her mother committed suicide, which was an event that was doomed to repeat itself throughout her family. After the rise of the Nazis, Salomon's father was interned in concentration camps, and the family escaped to France after Kristallnacht, where Salomon was looked after by her grandparents. This is where suicide comes back. Her grandmother, after several failed attempts, succeeded in committing suicide by throwing herself out of a window. She then found out that her aunt had done the same, and her great-grandmother, and several other family members, and she herself struggled with her mental health throughout her life. After spending some time with her grandfather, who on top of everything else proved to be abusive, and escaping that, she began creating what was to become a huge piece of work called Leben oder Theater, Life or Theatre, which was a mammoth selection of 769 paintings, some of them on really gigantic pieces of paper, quite literally larger than life. And by 1943, as the Nazis were closing in on Jews hiding in the south of France, Salomon decided to hide her work with a doctor that she knew, and her and her then husband were dragged from their house and eventually sent to Auschwitz, where she was killed in the gas chambers, and she was 5 months pregnant at the time. Despite this intense and imaginable tale of woe, the horror of the threat she lived under, both from suicidal tendencies, predatory protectors, and lethal Nazi invasions, everything else that a woman had to deal with and contend with in the mid-20th century, Leben oder Theater is defiant and impressively assertive, an expression of Salomon's wish to hold the reins on the journey of her own life. In discovering her life as an artist, she reclaims the position of power that has been denied to her by enemy forces in all directions. And I just picked, if you can ever get to see it, the Leben oder Theater, it's amazing. But this is 2 slides from it, two of the pieces of work. The one on the left is from the middle of the work, a much earlier piece, and the one on the right takes up the place of one of the last slides. And you move from girlish, inexperienced painter who is very kind of stylized, almost bordering on the cliche, to on the right-hand side where she has become the artist. Her body has become the art with Leben oder Theater written on it. And with the blank canvas reflecting out, I think it shows a transition from her not really being the kind of subject of her and the object of her life and looking out at it and trying to capture it, to then owning it and claiming mastery over it. And there was this great piece in the New Yorker that said, who is this? Perhaps it is Salomon's namesake, her Aunt Charlotte, rising from the Schlachtensee where she drowned herself at the age 18. This was the death of her aunt, was what really inspired the launch of Life or Leben oder Theater. But perhaps it is Salomon herself emerging from her own Orphic journey. Perhaps she is a Herbaic sister to Botticelli's Sea-Born Venus, stripped of her finery by modernity and violence. This tidal wave is Salomon's final missive to us, her expulsive upward trajectory into a mythic androgynous creature. She is a woman, an artist, a revolution. And I just think that's wonderful. Here is a woman who had all choices imaginable, including the choice of life, stripped from her, and eventually knowing that all those choices were to disappear, and yet her art is pounding with agency and thriving with choice. A little further on along the line then from Salomon is Paula Rego, who is an artist born in Portugal in 1935, who spent much of her life in the UK studying and working to become a visual artist and an amazing painter. She spent her early years in Portugal under Salazar, the dictator and authoritarian leader of regime that lasted for decades in Portugal, but that experience of that in her work is contrasted by her life and early years of marriage in 60s London, particularly in Camden, kind of a bohemian lifestyle, which I think is continuously conflicted throughout her work. And she did paint a series on abortion, this being one of them, which in response to the failure of a referendum that took place on abortion in 1998 in Portugal, she did a series of pastel drawings which were really visceral in terms of their depiction of what took place when a woman had an abortion under such restrictive regimes and the secretive nature of the way in which it would have to happen. But she was very sure in herself of not wanting to paint women who were having abortions as sort of agency-less victims. So she said in an interview that this is another thing that is not in our culture, which I show in the picture of the girl, this picture, the girl facing you with her legs up called Leela. There was one point where she looked really triumphant, and then something happened in the picture as if she had been slapped across the face, you see, and then she is being humiliated, and yet she is triumphant, completely triumphant. These are not pictures of victims. And in all of Paula Rego's works, the women in it, no matter how debased they are, no matter how extreme the horrors they are being put through or the difficulties they're being put through, they are extremely triumphant. And her insistence that women might be victims of social repression or dangerous medical practices and that their bodies might be in danger doesn't mean that they should inhabit the position of victim, and I think this is incredibly powerful. But actually it wasn't the series on abortion that I think is most inspiring by Rego, but these other drawings, these other paintings that she did, these two depict women living under Salazar. This one on the left is a policeman's daughter, and this one on the right is a soldier's daughter. And it's just the representation, the muscles, the wide-legged stance, the, defiant hand in the boot, the kind of almost sassy facial expressions, really define the sense of how she's trying to portray women as, not the damsel in distress, not the weeping, kind of fainting, sort of almost pathetic kind of display that sometimes we have of victims, even though that might sound a bit harsh, but defiant and strong and powerful and assertive. even these women who are defined in their roles by the roles of their fathers. And I just think that's a very powerful way of looking at women's agency. And then the final image I wanted to show you, this one is a fictional woman. This is a still from Joseph Strick's 1967 adaptation of James Joyce's 1922 novel, Ulysses. And this was a production that was banned for decades in Ireland, where it was filmed and produced. This is Molly Bloom. Molly Bloom is the wife of the book's protagonist, Leopold Bloom, and Ulysses is a book that really shook the 20th century. It was something that marked out the 1920s and indeed has marked out Irish and international literature ever since for its portrayal of one day in the life of one man and the people who are around him and the people he meets and his thoughts, and it just encapsulates all the swirling intensity of that particular period of art and politics and life, of everything changing. But Joyce decides to give the final words of his book to Molly, who has quite sort of lackadaisically spent the day in bed, having cheated on Leopold with a very handsome man called Blazes Boylan. And her final words are perhaps some of the strongest assertions of women's agency in art written by a man. So it can be done, it doesn't have to be written by a woman. And I just want to read a bit to you. Yes, when I put the rose in my hair like the Andalusian girls used, or shall I wear a red? Yes, and how he kissed me under the Moorish wall, and I thought, well as him as any other. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes, and then he asked me, would I, yes, to say my mountain flower, and first I put my arms around him, yes, and drew him down to me so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes, and his heart was going mad, and yes, I said, yes, I will, yes. Apologies to the translators, there is no punctuation at the end of that soliloquy, so I'm not just trying to screw you up. But just the amount of yeses and the amount of I will and I said in that final passage is just, it never fails to move me about looking, to have a woman end the most important book of the 20th century with such an assertive, defiant stance, I think is wonderful. So, to conclude, I think freedom means being able to make choices for ourselves that others might think are wrong or stupid or fantastic, whatever, that others can have any kind of opinion of, but that we make those choices for ourselves, about ourselves. It's being able to define what your life will look like, or at least attempt to, by making choices based on your own sense of yourself. I think this is what abortion is really about. I mean, it is a practical thing. It's a solution to a medical problem. It's it's a procedure, it's a pill, it's it can be quite a visceral experience, or it can be as easy as getting a, ingrown toenail removed. Every woman is different and every woman will experience it differently. But I think morally and politically, it has a much more profound weight in the fact that how we think about abortion and how we value women's ability to make those decisions is the most important question. Not all women are the same, but all women must have the freedom to decide how they will live their lives and how their lives will shape up, inspired by women who have, throughout history, both fictional and real, pushed against the moral, legal, and political constraints that told them that they could not. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I haven't got enough hands, have I? Nah, that's okay, don't worry. Right, okay, thank you very much, Ella. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow Molly, but actually what I will say is that I once made 3 pots for Molly Bloom called Molly's Odyssey. So I shall post them so you can see, because I love that. And actually one of them is called Yes, in honor of that last paragraph. Right, so, okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to join this. I shall get, let's see. I am short of hands, yes, please.
Just say click.
Right, click, thank you. This short discussion paper considers a woman's right to choose as the right to be in control, as far as this is ever possible, over her own physical and sexual boundaries, and by extension, her reproductive capacity. So this is Princess Hymen, This is just one view of it. I completed Princess Hymen in 2007 after 4 years of research. It's about the virgin body, about hymen reconstruction and a female genital mutilation. With this pot, I'm questioning what the virgin body is. Who is a virgin? And why is the matter of sexual purity, if that's what it is, only ever considered with regard to girls and women? This hymen, perceived by the patriarchy as the gateway to our bodies, is jealously guarded as though it were the property of either the state or the family or both. The role of the state. The state will always try to exert control over the female body, and particularly over our reproductive capacity. Over the last 10 years or so, we have had persistent reports of Uyghur women in Xinjiang, China, being sterilized by force, for example, and also still in India, despite active feminist campaigns and a relatively free press. Campaigning by feminists in Britain in the 1970s and 80s for improved access to abortion and to contraception revealed marked differences in experiences of white women and Black and Asian women. The London-based group Southall Black Sisters were compelled to campaign against the widespread, apparently experimental use of Depo-Provera on Asian women. Depo-Provera basically suppresses ovulation. So it's quite a kind of long-term, it's quite a drastic form of contraception. And they also brought to light compulsory virginity testing of Asian women at Heathrow Airport. This was part of British state immigration policy. Conversely, a few years ago, the Ukrainian feminist group Femen protested outside the Indian embassy in Kiev about the compulsory HIV testing of women from Ukraine going to India. In the 1980s and 90s, Brixton Black Women's Group reported that they found abortions were often not so difficult to get and were sometimes offered or encouraged even when not actually requested. It is still the case that for some Black American families, the capacity to nurse, nurture, and raise their own children is something extraordinarily special, having been expected to put aside the needs of their own young to nurture white babies instead. This is still part of living memory, particularly in the southern United States. So a woman's right to choose, either to use contraception, to have an abortion, to keep a child, to nurse, nurture, raise a child, it very often hangs on a knife edge much of the time, and it should never be taken for granted. The situations I've described are part of what I consider to be the nationalized models, controlling women's sexual boundaries and reproductive capacity. These have all been part of either local or national government policy. The privatized model hands power over to the family, particularly to the paterfamilias, the father. The power is devolved from state individuals to communities, but it can be requisitioned by the state via government or religious institutions at any time. Thank you. This is image 2. This is also part of Princess Hymen. It's the other side of the pot. So it's 2 meters high, this pot. So as you saw from the photo before, that's bigger than I am. Now, Princess Hymen's imagery comes from the bathhouse. It's adapted from the 19th century French Orientalist painting on one side, and on the other, from Athenian red figureware from 5000 BC. And also from old drawings of mine, done in the 1980s, that's this side, from a local bathhouse in Lewisham in South London. It combines the fetishization of the female body with having a laugh with friends and a bit of mutual grooming. It's one of 5 similar-sized pots called Shattered, which grew out of a statement that I've heard many women, so often I've heard women say this, I was shattered. Now I'm trying to piece myself slowly back together. The broken and mended pot is basically a metaphor for trauma and survival. Princess Hymen is shattered and precariously rebuilt. The pressure of living in a society that insists upon female purity as the symbol of the honor for the male or for the family or for the nation state is both intolerable and profoundly destructive. In this environment, girls and women have very little choice about whether or not to engage in sexual activity or relationships, never mind over their reproductive decisions. Okay, so the next one, Ella, thanks. This is February Dark and Cold, and it's one of the pots from a project called And the Door Open, and which is my partnership project with Women at the Well. Women at the Well is a women-only service. It's based in King's Cross in London, and it provides support to women in prostitution and also to those at risk. It also provides practical support and solutions to women who are wanting to exit the sex trade. To protect the confidentiality of the women that I'm working with, I work with prepared accounts that are supplied to me by Women at the Well, and they are from the women that they support. So some of the women are still in the sex trade, others have exited already. Now I've chosen two different pots for this section. One illustrates an account of a young woman who was groomed at an early age and was pimped into prostitution as a minor, and the other is based on an account of a sex trade survivor, a woman who exited some years ago and who was compelled by her life situation, poverty and street homelessness, and very few choices, having left school as a young teenager with no qualifications. Okay, February Dark and Cold is based on an account of a young woman, Gemma, not her real name, who was 15 years old at the start of her story, and whose mother had a job that frequently took her abroad. She seems to have had no other parent or guardian, and so was left alone and potentially quite vulnerable. The account is sparse. At some point she has a son. She also has drink and drug problems, and there is a developing quite serious mental health difficulties. When Women at the Well first meet her, age 15, she's being sold for sex on the London streets. They help her to return to her family in the northern town, but she leaves again. It appears there is some sexual abuse or exploitation there, but it isn't spelled out. She returns to London, and she is street homeless and extremely vulnerable to further exploitation in prostitution. She describes the cold and the dark of February and the violence of the London streets. At some point, she is arrested and is in prison for a while. Once out of prison, she contacts Women at the Well and again gets support with drugs and alcohol problems. They also help her to find a housing solution. This is a very young woman with a history of abuse going back to her early teenage years, who now has an interlocking mix of problems, which together make housing and future life extremely difficult. The pot, as you can see here, has a number of gaps and cracks. This young woman's process of mending her life is only midway through, probably. She still has a long way to go. She's missing her child. It's unclear where her mother is and where the rest of her family is, or indeed what their relationship is like. What is clear is she knows that Women at the Well are able to provide her with support when she needs it. So next slide, please. Oh, thanks. This is also February Dark and Cold. This is one of the other views. So I've shut Gemma's past away inside the pot, but it appears in the cracks from time to time. The common thread in all these accounts, and therefore in all the pots in this series, is trauma. These are women who are grossly abused and exploited from an early age and exposed to persistent violence and brutality. Recovery from trauma is a long process and rarely complete. Sex trade survivors remain vulnerable to further pressure. The broken pot, mended but not fully, is a metaphor for surviving sexual violence and exploitation. It's not easy to do justice to these accounts. I didn't want to avoid the shattering experiences women endured, but nor did I want to reproduce the violence in pictures. Breaking and rebuilding the pot seemed like the best approach. It presents the slow recovery and the lasting vulnerability, but it also honours the courage of the women to survive and find different lives. So the last image then, yes. So this one is Brave Face, and this is a work in progress. Brave Face is based on an account by a sex trade survivor, Rachel Moran, who talks about the process by which women and teenage girls enter the sex trade. Choice is not part of the decision. It's a spurious kind of protection. It may also be that she decides she has no other choice because she needs the cash. In that case, the cash is the coercion, says Moran. One is compelled by life circumstances. Once it has started, it becomes increasingly difficult to leave. Add to that the violence of the pimp or the punters, and you have a situation where the woman concerned is rapidly losing any control she may have hoped that she would have. Moran also makes no distinction between trafficking and the decision to enter the sex trade. Trafficking is often characterized as force and held to be distinct from choice prostitution. In reality, there's very little difference. All trafficked girls and women, whether they are being moved from one country to another or from one city to another within the same national borders, or from one side of a street to another, or not really moved at all, are subject to the force of their circumstances. Even if they are one of very few women operating completely independently without a pimp of any sort, the power of the punter is still considerable and exerted often through a combination of cash and the potential for violence, whether or not he actually uses it. Of the women legally identified as trafficked, having crossed a national border, the vast majority have accepted what they believe to be a legitimate offer of employment. They're not anticipating entering the sex trade. Brave Face is the face of every sexually exploited girl or woman who goes to meet her next John, the man, the punter, the sex buyer. It is also the gradually building sense of disassociation that every survivor has. It is part of her survival strategy. Bodily autonomy, then, is not really available to women exploited in prostitution. Moran tells us this is not about what women want to do with their bodies. The men pay us to do what they want to do with the women they use. The cash also buys their silence. And she then talks also about the use of abortion in prostitution. And many survivors actually have talked about this. Women in prostitution may be forced by the pimp into having an abortion if the punter refused to use a condom and if she gets pregnant. Or they may be forced to keep the baby so that the pimp can sell it onto the surrogacy trade. The sex trade feeds the surrogacy market, which is essentially the farming of wombs of impoverished women. Ukraine is one of the central international hubs for surrogacy. And although commercial surrogacy is technically illegal in India, according to the feminist filmmaker Vaishnavi Sundar, it still thrives to meet a large and indeed growing international and national market. So in conclusion, bodily autonomy and control over our sexual boundaries is fundamental to sexual equality and to women's liberation. Many women across the world do not have even the most basic reproductive rights, including to free, safe contraception, or even to proper healthcare, never mind safe abortion. And where we do have these rights in place, as Manick observed in the United States, Maurice also here in Poland, they are constantly under attack. So I'm going to argue that we must always, always be vigilant.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for the previous papers. I don't have any images, so I'm just going to read my text and extemporize a little bit at the end, but I'll try to speak slowly for the translators. So, in an ideal world, no human being would feel compelled or be compelled to have sex against their will, or to have sex with no conception of possible consequences. In an ideal world, everyone would be able to afford to have children if they wanted them. We do not live in an ideal world. Abortion is, of course, in itself a major issue, and no more so than in the past couple of weeks, because the dominance of American politics for everybody. But abortion is also the flashpoint for every other question, potentially. So everything to do with economics, politics, sex, sexual difference, value, and humanity itself. While it is not easy, and indeed not always strategic, to avoid any discussion of abortion outside of the immediacy of political pressures, depending on context, which is always important, the framing of the abortion question today, where, as I've already said, as with many issues, American framing shapes everything, makes it harder to think about the broader questions raised by the issue. Not the least of which, of course, is economic. At one end, it is getting hard for people, even in wealthy countries, to have children or feel that they're able to have children. And many millennials, so people who are now 40 at the oldest, who cannot afford somewhere to live, who remain with their parents, for example, are not having children. They feel economically unable to do so, right, even in rich countries. For many feminists, of course, reproduction has been understood historically as part and parcel of women's exploitation. In recent years, and in the kind of materialist or Marxist feminist tradition, we've had many discussions of the kinds of labor that constitute women's work and how exploitation, including the pressure to perform love or to have children out of gendered expectation, is present in the private as well as in the public realm. It's very difficult to untangle these forms of how we understand this question as an individual choice or as part of a larger economic set of circumstances. They're kind of indissociable. But perhaps surprisingly, even within feminism itself, abortion is not a straightforward question, and nor was it historically either. While liberal feminism dominates the current moment in the West, it is not the only perspective that has existed on this question. Liberal feminism takes as its core understanding of the world the centrality of the individual, the rights-bearing subject. Its keywords are choice and freedom. And I think Ella clearly outlined some of this perspective in her paper. So thus we've inherited the slogan, my body, my choice, very central to defense of abortion. The rights of the mother take precedence over the rights of any future child because the adult is in possession of autonomy and the fetus or child is not or not yet. Liberal feminism is, however, in many ways completely compatible with a certain kind of contemporary consumer capital in that it prioritizes desire and often comfort and safety as well as choice over any other value. We might have an image of freedom that exceeds this, or that we might want to defend outside of the image of freedom that capital itself promotes, which I think we need to discuss. But at the same time, we must acknowledge, I think, that this idea of the liberal, freely choosing individual has led to some potentially very dystopian aspects, which I think Claudia touched on in her mention of surrogacy, for example, the separation of maternity from childbirth and the commercial exploitation of women. We are also seeing the erosion of language around womanhood for a variety of reasons, the separation of body and mind which is extremely dehumanizing and very, very, like I say, dystopian. So the reproductive technologies that have come historically, so not only abortion, which is obviously very old, but everything that came from the sexual revolution in terms of contraception, in terms of IVF, in terms of things like ultrasound, have a potentially negative valence and a dystopian aspect too, as we see, for example, in the use of ultrasound in countries where femicide is very high, so where you have the technology to identify the sex of the fetus, and parents are choosing to abort female fetuses because they prefer to have a male. So I think we have to be extremely careful when we're thinking about any idea of progress, of technology, of the freedoms that come from a certain image of a sexual revolution. They also have an extremely dark side, which often punish women as at the same time as they promise liberation for women in the image of the liberal individual, which is a very masculinist model. I think also we saw tensions with this idea of choice, my body, my choice, in relation to the lockdowns and to the vaccines, where my body, my choice became a slogan used by those who didn't want to take the vaccine. You could say that the bounds of individual choice are tested to the limits where there is an issue of general social concern, right? So the idea, many people were very upset that my body, my choice became the slogan of people who didn't want to take the vaccine because the idea was that this was socially irresponsible, that you can't be an individual, a liberal individual in this way in the context of something like a virus. But I think it also points to something in the tension in the slogan itself, right, which needs unpicking. So this was perceived to be a matter of general social concern. You can't be an individual in the middle of a pandemic. But we could turn it around and say, well, why isn't abortion also a matter of social concern? After all, it is a central feature of the social fabric, as is the question of how families are supported, whether people feel able to have children, and so on. These are social questions. It certainly tells you something about the society you live in, what the rules around abortion are, and as in Poland, as we understand, or whether the rules are more liberal, as in the UK. Is sex, therefore, a matter of social concern, or is it solely and only a personal matter? Many regimes, religious and non-religious, have sought to legislate on matters of sexual morality, of course. Liberal regimes, outside of extreme cases, seek to leave sex up to the individual. So sexual preference, sexual choice, sexual behavior is perceived to be a private and an individual matter. Although, of course, the state becomes involved if there is an abortion or if a mother gives birth. And, you know, I think Agnieszka mentioned the horrors of what happens when you tie a national project to motherhood and enforced birth in the name of, let's say, a race, or, you know, rewarding mothers for having children, for example, medals for motherhood. You know, we've seen this in various countries in history, right? So it's goes both ways, right? When the state seeks to intervene to such a degree. Pregnancy, in and of itself, actually also complicates the assumption of the liberal individual, because here there is no longer one person, and freedom, in inverted commas, understood as freedom from all constraint, is massively curtailed. You're no longer an autonomous individual. As many philosophers and feminists have pointed out, our understanding of the liberal individual is radically altered if we begin not with the free agent making rational calculations about what he or she wants to do, but rather with relationality as such, and vulnerability and dependence and all of these deeply anthropological dimensions which we all participate in. We all begin in relation, in vulnerability and dependence, and usually where we end as well. Like even in a normal everybody's lifespan, the moments at which we are an autonomous, freely choosing rational individual are actually much less than we might understand from the liberal project. We are in fact enmeshed in social relations and relations of dependency all the way through. If birth, childhood, and motherhood were more respected in our culture, this would have serious implications for how we understand morality and values. Altruism rather than egoism would be much more comprehensible, for example, if we took as our model the relationship between parent and child or mother and child, rather than taking the free-floating, choice-making individual as our fundamental social unit, right? So what I'm suggesting is that the mother and the child relation, that bond, if we took that as the fundamental ontological example or the normative example of what it is to be human, we would then have a completely different set of values and morality. And we would also have much more respect for women, as I say, who are being dehumanized, who are being treated as body parts, who are being kind of absolutely separated from dignity in value, in language and in reality. I'd just like to know, as well as a matter of historical record, that many early feminists were not in favor of abortion. They were extremely against abortion. For example, Susan B. Anthony and Alice Paul in the US, for example, they regarded abortion as part of the continued exploitation of women because it allowed men not to take responsibility for their actions, right? And I'm noting this just to say that the history of feminism is more complicated than we might think. It's not always that feminism has been strictly pro-abortion, for example. It's very interesting to think about what it means to tie men, let's say, to responsibility, and it actually expect men to have to deal with the consequences of their behavior, which is what the early suffragettes and the feminists were saying, at least in some countries. Some radical feminists also, who are not in the least bit religious, and have no relation to patriarchal religions like Catholicism, also understood abortion in the 70s in the context of men's poor behavior. And due to their kind of anti-violence stance, regarded abortion as a harm, proposing instead that children accidentally conceived or conceived through rape or by irresponsible men should instead be collectively raised by women, and that potential children should not be punished because of men's irresponsible behavior. So even outside of religious arguments against abortion, it is important to note that there is not one single feminist position that we can hold up above all others and say, well, this is obviously the correct line. Outside of extreme cases where the mother's life is at risk, or in cases of rape or incest, most abortions do not fall into these categories. The leaking of the Roe v. Wade decision might spring this issue on everybody, but it also gives us a positive opportunity to think or rethink about the kinds of societies we live in, how we might revalue sex, whether people should be having casual sex that might potentially lead to an abortion, and what that says about a culture that encourages that. And lots of younger women, if you look at what they're saying about their sexual encounters, a lot of them are basically often reinventing marriage. They're wondering, oh, wouldn't it be great if men could, take responsibility for their behavior and look after me and my child, as if this is some absurd demand, but from the standpoint of a liberal capitalist consumer position, of course it's an absurd demand to demand loyalty or responsibility or duty or any of these things which have been completely eroded. I think there's a broader point which I just want to raise, which is to do with where we are at in relation to the sexual revolution. We are 60 years after this revolution, which is a technological revolution which had immense social changes. For the first time, it completely detached sex from reproduction, potentially. I think we are maybe heading into a period of sex negativity, which I think will be very interesting. And again, a lot of young people are turning away from sex, especially sex that would possibly result in conception. And I wonder, also in the wake of the lockdowns and the kind of edicts against touch, we're moving to a much more virtual, much more dissociated world. for better or worse. And whilst I don't think that the human animal is going to stop having sex, I think we are sort of programmed or conditioned to do so. I do think there is a kind of very interesting opportunity to maybe 60 years, as I say, after the sexual revolution, to pause and ask actually whether we want to continue down certain paths, which in my view are dehumanizing, anti-human, and often extremely misogynist. So I think we actually have an opportunity not to fall into the simple opposition of being pro-choice or pro-life, as in the American discussion, but to ask these broader questions about economics, society, value, sexual difference, and how we treat each other, including those who are not yet born and not yet with us. So yeah, thank you.
Please, let's give a round of applause to the 4 amazing speakers and the perspectives that all 4 have given. If we think about agency, choice of freedom of choice, women's freedom, which obviously Ella has very strongly argued for, about individual autonomy, female autonomy, women's autonomy. And then, with Claudia, the complete loss of that through the patriarchy, through the loss of freedom in a very cruel and uncomfortable position. And then Nina's critique of the liberal feminist, which is certainly the feminism that the other forms of feminism I really had no idea about. We do think about it as individual female autonomy, and that it is a private choice, and that it is finally the woman's choice. So this kind of tension between individualism and how that feeds into the capitalist system, and altruism, which is kind of positing an alternative way of life or thinking, and wonderful to see some art from a young Polish artist, and just thinking about nationalist tendencies. We are living in a very interesting world. It doesn't feel there is a kind of utopian / dystopian about it, depending on your point of view. We're talking, only yesterday in the Daily Mail, they were talking about transplanting female womb into a man. Possibly that one day in the future, a man will have a baby through these experiments on womb transplants. And also in China, we're looking at almost artificial womb factories that might be developed to counteract its destructive one-child policy that was in action for 35 years, and the enforced abortions that happened there by the state and by rural village councils. So it's a very complex subject, and if we think about the future, the transhumanist kind of possibility, if we think about the female body, and that this could be desexed, and the reproductive potential outside of the female body is also, some people may like that and some people won't. It's, in my personal view, quite scary and quite uncomfortable. So let's maybe get some thoughts on your various kind of positions, and Ella, I'd like to ask you, what were your thoughts on the very obviously radical alternative proposal that Nina was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of individual freedom being masculine, or indeed the idea that individual freedom is some kind of expression of consumer capitalism, I would quibble, to put it lightly, with, because I think the whole not to delve into a long drawn out sort of debate over Marx, but the way I understand, capitalism and the way in which women's position under capitalism is primarily through the reproduction of new labour and labourers. So that's why they were tied to the home, and indeed why having kids is so important, because you produce the next set of workers. So it seems to me that individual freedom, and indeed women's individual freedom to either say, no, I'm not going to have a child, I'm going to go off and do whatever I want, and I'm not going to marry and blah, 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 or actually I am going to do that, but it's not going to define me. That assertion of individual freedom, particularly for women in capitalist societies, is not capitulation, but a form of revolution. And the kind of, I think that the idea of what makes us human, I think abortion is a perfect and very powerful expression of what does make us human, because we are not just animals that reproduce evolutionary impulses, but we are, what differentiates us from the monkeys and the snails is that we make choices, we think about things, we rebel, we make bad choices, we make good choices, and indeed making, there really cannot be anything more fundamentally life-changing for a woman than having a baby, because it completely it's one of the most, I haven't just had too much pierogi, by the way, I am actually 5 months pregnant, so all of this is very live in my head at the moment, and birth itself is, believe me, it's not something I'm particularly looking forward to. It's a very visceral thing that happens to you bodily and emotionally and all the rest of it, but also, it does, I think, where I agree with Nina is the very strongly is the concept of motherhood and the status of motherhood and the importance of raising children and socializing children has been downplayed, to put it lightly, over the last sort of few decades. We're also now in this, talk about dystopian, we're also now in this incredibly dystopian position, just to sort of flip what Nina was saying, where actually I think more often than not there is social pressures put on women and women's bodies to answer societal questions via their wombs. One of the most, I think, heinous examples of this is the movement Birth Strike, which is an offshoot of Extinction Rebellion, environmentalist group that have been all over the news in England and in other countries, where groups of men and women are saying that they're going on birth strike and that they want to have children. They really do. Women really want to have a baby, but they can't, and they don't think women should, because having babies is going to ruin the planet. Now, I can't think of anything worse for the fertility rate than putting the fate of the planet at women's wombs. I mean, it really is quite disgusting in terms of the kind of pressure that you put on women. But, the thing about abortion and the thing about, or indeed about pregnancy and having a child, is that it is, you might, in the abstract, we might have a political discussion about fertility rates and what it means to how we value the family and things like that, which I think are all important. But on a, I'm not having a baby in order to up the UK fertility rate. I'm having a baby because I want to become a mother and because me and my partner want to become parents. And indeed, I think that, where I would disagree with Nina is the advance of, I don't see dystopia in the advance of technology. I see it as a wonderful liberatory tool for women. Cars can kill people, but we still think cars are brilliant. There is, well, you can sort of overdose someone with too much medicine that's good for you. Obviously things in the wrong, and this is, to respond to kind of Claudia, powers and freedoms and in the wrong hands can always go wrong. But indeed, things like IVF, to which I owe my pregnancy, and ultrasounds and all of that, I think are ways in which women can know more about themselves, can take more control of their lives. Even actually, I challenge this idea that there's always something terrible about gender selective abortion. It's a very kind of a difficult issue to talk about. And while we might in the abstract say, no, it's definitely not a good thing to be aborting just on the basis of gender because it ties into sexist societies. But I would find it very difficult to say to a woman who, I mean, I'm from Irish Catholic background, know lots of women who had 11 kids before the 11th was a boy, because, you know, that's what that particularly family dynamic required. I would be loath to say to a woman in that position, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to deal with the dynamics of you and your husband's relationship of having a girl, because I think it's wrong for you to abort on the basis of sex. It's, you know, strangers and outsiders trying to make decisions about women's personal lives can never be right. It is something that I think a woman herself knows what decision is right for her, and sometimes those decisions are made in extremely difficult circumstances. But just the last thing I wanted to talk about is, because I think it's really interesting, is the vaccine abortion debate. I recently wrote an article for the New Statesman calling the American rights bluff and saying, you know, okay, you say my body, my choice because you don't want vaccine mandates, which, by the way, I completely agree with. I don't think you should be forced to take a vaccine, though I'm very, very pro-vaccine. Why do you not want to extend that fantastic slogan, my body, my choice, to women? And I think we should be trying to link up those two things, because fundamentally it comes down to, and you know, maybe I'll just throw it out there, I'm very much for not criminalizing surrogacy and not criminalizing prostitution. I think that if you have a principle of a woman's right to choose what happens to her body, then that extends to all eventualities. And that's not to say that you condone coercion or violence, or that you don't think those things are a problem or something should be done about that. But if you think that women should be able to do what she wants with her body for good or for evil or whatever you think, then that's what you think. And it does come down to a binary principle of whether or not you believe in that or not. And so, you know, on the vaccine question, it's you know, a virus is not, a baby is not a virus. And that they're incomparable in terms of that. And a pregnancy is not a virus, but an unwanted pregnancy is still a problem to be dealt with. And so the question of bodily autonomy, of people's rights, of people's freedoms, I think are, rather than being either liberal feminist or sort of capitulating to capitalism or some kind of unnuanced position, it is just simply a principle of, you know, from the Enlightenment onwards, that human beings are rational, reasoned, and revolutionary thinkers, and that fundamental to being able to make those rational, reasonable, and revolutionary decisions is the question of individual freedom. And so I've got that bit between my teeth, and I'm never going to give it up, the question of freedom.
Right, so there's lots of disagreements, which is great, from sex industry workers and also about reproductive rights and the utopian future that you see in technology, Ella, and maybe less so on Nina's part. Who would like to respond to anything else?
I sort of think
Claudia.
I'd to at least
Claudia.
correct an impression, maybe. I'm not quite sure. I'm wholly against prostitution being criminalised as well, entirely opposed to it. I am in favour of criminalising sex buyers and the overwhelmingly men, but not exclusively so, those who are making the money from it. But I repeat, since I think Manick actually said it on my behalf in the introduction, I advocate on behalf of what's called the equality model of legal reform in the UK, which recommends that absolutely all prostituted persons are decriminalised, and also that their any records of having been criminalised are now removed. So that, I mean, the idea, you know, absolutely lovely. I entirely subscribe to the idea that a woman should do what she wants with her body. Of course she should. It's just that it has absolutely no connection whatsoever with the sex trade, and never has. It's just, it is irrelevant. So, yeah, choice, hurrah. but it's just got nothing to do with the sex trade. And it is true that there are certainly, I mean, you know, I have known many women very close to me who have made the decision, but a decision is not the same as a choice. A choice is being presented with a box of chocolates and going, oh, which one shall I have? What a lovely selection there is. A decision is, okay, if I can't pay the rent, I'm going to be thrown out of this damn house, in which case I'm going to be street homeless, in which case I'm going to be vulnerable to this anyway. Maybe if I actually take the decision myself, I've got a better chance of surviving this. Many, 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 many women make that decision. Vast, increasingly large numbers of women make that decision. And I know because, I mean, women at the Well meet them all the time, as do Beyond the Streets, as does absolutely everybody, every support service ever. I mean, I was involved in setting up Rape Crisis in South London in the 1970s. I met plenty of women who did. But, you know, that is not the same thing as a free choice. That's precisely what Rachel Moran is referring to when she says you are compelled by life. This is coercion by life. It's coercion by life circumstances. It is the cash that is coercion. And it's emphatically so, because soon as the man gives the woman that cash, she knows that she is then silenced, that she has absolutely, you know, and there are some of the very interesting evidence that you know, any sex trade survivor will tell you, and actually indeed a great many women who are still in the sex trade will tell you, is that they get rid of that money as soon as they possibly can because they hate it. So a choice is a top idea. It's just that it's not really a particular, you know, it's that doesn't mean that women in the sex trade are not making decisions. It doesn't mean that they don't have what Ella's referred to as agency. It does, I mean, they're making decisions all the time. Absolutely. Intelligent decisions, survival decisions, decisions from day to day, from hour to hour. There's agency is there the whole time. These are enormously resourceful women who are surviving extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So, you know, I do want to say I do actually just terribly strongly reject the use of the term victim as a pejorative. It's something I've always absolutely despised. It's something, unfortunately, that I feel partially responsible for as well, because it's something that really grew in the 1970s. It's very much part of second wave feminism. Now, I was actually at school in the 1970s. I didn't really become an active feminist until the very, very early 80s, just on the sort of cusp. But, you know, I'm part of that second wave movement without a doubt. And I well remember being part of the sex Rape Crisis and all sorts of organisations, anti-violence against women organisations, the Incest Survivors Group, all sorts of things. And, you know, and consistently say, well, we know, you know, we don't use the term victim, we use survivor or whatever it is. And, you know, at the same time, thinking to myself in my own private thoughts, you know, I was raped, I got pregnant as a result of that rape, I had an abortion as a result of that pregnancy. And that was the decision that I made. And, you know, all the time I was thinking to myself, well, sometimes I feel like a victim, sometimes I feel like a survivor, and sometimes I feel like somebody who's just getting through the days one at a time. And that's not really either victim or survivor. Survivor has a sort of triumphalist quality about it, and we're not all survivors all of the time. And, but, you know, a victim is something that is, you know, either has a legal designation, as in one is a victim of crime, or a victim of an alleged crime, and one is also a victim of circumstances, and that does not make you a bad person, or a weak person, or a person without agency. Not by any stretch of the imagination does it do that. It is simply an accurate description of a reality. That's it. So, yeah.
Thanks, Claudia.
You're welcome.
And it's great to get that perspective and that clarification there. I think none of us really wants to criminalize women, you know, for something where they are forced to enter an industry that may not be that noble. So, Nina, Is there anything you'd like to add to that? I mean, it's very interesting because talking about female infanticide, that kind of ties in with some of the economics, the kind of financial economic kind of justifications for abortion, which I just saw on Twitter today that there's the feminist case and there's the the much wider case that people are starting to put forward, which is an economic case for abortion. And I think you kind of touched on that a bit, Nina. Is there anything you'd like to kind of elaborate about that in terms of capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of things. It's kind of horribly obvious, I suppose, that if you have various forms of I don't know, the global movement of labour, you don't necessarily need within a country to reproduce the labour force, right? That that this is a global economic question, and there's forms of liberalism in some countries that might pertain to its citizens, but they're not detachable from the decisions that are being made about other people's lives in other countries, or the economic forms of coercion and exploitation that are involved in people being moved around as labourers, so I don't think they're detachable, and I would strongly, disagree respectfully with Ella's kind of very clearly articulated position on liberal freedom, but I think that this is not the only way of conceiving of who we are collectively as humanity, or what our values are. I don't think the freedom of the individual trumps everything else. I think this is an extremely ultimately destructive fantasy of a world without limits, bodies without limits, the idea that we can simply do whatever we want because it's what we want. This is the underlying ontology of consumer capital. It's like, I want something, therefore I should have it, right? We've got no conception of tragedy, of acceptance, of the fact that actually maybe it's not always a good thing to get what you want, and that there are limits. There are limits to bodies, there are limits to lives, and there's ways of kind of coping with that. And if we had a kind of, a richer culture, a culture that didn't prioritize this limitless free spinning in the void, individual choice, we would have a much more, I think, beautiful, poetic, and maybe even more melancholic understanding of life collectively. That we would feel more for each other in our difference, and in our difference of what we're able to do or what we can do. So I really would strongly argue against commercial surrogacy. I would argue very, very strongly against deciding to abort on the basis of sex. I think this is absolutely abhorrent. I mean, this is inhuman, and I think this technology, I would just stress again, has an extremely dark side. It's extremely dystopian. It reduces human beings to tools as well, and we are increasingly the tool of the tools, right? We all are, and I think we have to take a step back all the time and think about what these technologies are doing to us, what these conceptions of the human are making us into, and what we are losing as we kind of pursue our, freedom and desire and all of these things that we're actually always being taught to do, as well as if we're somehow free of ideology, when we're absolutely not. We're being completely conditioned by those ideas.
Thank you. I'm going to open out now. Oh, sorry, Agnieszka wants to.
Just before we open up to the audience, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned the name of the artist, Marta Mysza. So that's the first point. And then also, I was thinking about, as I mentioned, I think it would touch upon what Nina was talking about, the values and how we want to orient ourselves. And in relation to that, as I was preparing for our meeting today, our discussion, I was listening to various sources and gathering information. And I was listening to conversation in relation to Israel and Jewish nation. And there is one anecdote that I thought might lighten up a bit the atmosphere, but at the same time show how you orient yourself as a society, as a group of people, that kind of changes the dynamic. And I've been learning Hebrew since since surviving the terror attack, and I love this culture. I love the love for the lust for life, the resilience, the strength. And when I was listening to the podcast today, the conversation about that, there was an example said that the IVF is supported in Israel, and when there was a discussion to limit the amount of IVFs the woman is able to have from the public purse, because it was stopping at number 7, a number of families came with the successful baby from the number 8 to the TV, and they demanded that they will be on TV to show the proof, not to stop the funding. And so I thought this affirmation of life and the society holding each other together was quite life-affirming and a positive ray of light. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnieszka. Right, I'd like to open it out to you folks for any questions that you'd like to ask of any member of our panel. So, Agnieszka's going to pass the microphone. Thank you.
It's our regular guest. I'm so happy to see him.
Yes, welcome back.
Nice to see you.
Okay, so I want to ask for your stance on a certain issue. And I have to mention that this, like the worldview which I'm gonna explain, it's not mine, so I may not present it correctly, but some people think that, like, while the body of the woman is her choice, but when women with, let's say, problematic backgrounds, for example, drug addiction or alcohol addictions, or like just that come from a poor background, they want to have a baby, have a child, and like they doom this child to live in a like in the suffering conditions. So like because of their ego, because of their own choice, the other person, the person with their own consciousness, is doomed to maybe even have some kind of physical problems, disabilities, because like we all know that if the woman like has the alcohol addiction or drug addiction, the baby may be born with some disabilities, or because of such background of his or her mother, the baby will suffer mental issues. So like because and because of all of that, maybe some women should be not allowed to give birth. And I say again, it's not my position, so I may not present it correctly, and I disagree with it. But some people think like that, and what's your opinion about it, about such a stance on the state of things? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm sure you're being devil's advocate there, but I think it's a question that should be responded to.
Yeah, don't mind.
I'd be happy to answer.
We'll take Nina first, and then Claudia and Ella.
Well, I mean, you know, let's also be clear. Historically, a lot of humanists and indeed a lot of early feminists were eugenicists in this respect, which I think we should also remember. And eugenics was a very popular way of seeing the world, right, for people who regarded themselves as progressive, because they said, well, you know, precisely, it's not good for humanity for certain people to reproduce. And of course, then we also see eugenics in action in very repressive regimes, and you know, the sterilization of women went on in places like Sweden until extremely recently, right? So it's always this kind of contextual political question, right? I think, again, and I don't think this avoids the question, but I think it's like, what is a culture that values those forms of choices, right, in terms of a culture that doesn't protect people from their own desires, where those desires are negative for that person, right? It tells you something, again, about the culture and the society in which we live in, right? I don't personally think that women who have these issues should be prevented from having children. If they so want, they may need support, they might need help and medical attention and so on, and, you know, I think that's important. So I'm very against this form of eugenics, obviously, let me be clear. But you know, it's also a social question, right? What kind of world we live in where certain desires are prioritized over others? You know, the idea that freedom is the freedom to be an addict is a very, very poor notion of freedom.
Thank you. Claudia?
Yes, I'd forgotten there were people like that. Sorry, but yes, it is first thing I think I'm going to say is that every survivor of the sex trade I've ever met has at least one child, at least. And in every case, actually, the kind of fierce determination to protect and raise that child and provide that child with a different life from the one that she herself has had to get through, that has been a major source of inspiration to helping her away from the sex trade and into a different life that she finds more productive and useful. And so I would be, I mean, many survivors of the sex trade, and indeed many women in the sex trade, really have to fight tooth and nail to keep their kids. And, overall I would exactly as Nina said, they may very well need help. They may well need services to help, all in favour of that, for sure. And indeed friends and also family members sometimes, very often do help out in that situation. So I think that's I hope that would perhaps deal with what we might call antisocial side of it, which was so. It is also true that a great many women who are in the sex trade have problems with either drink or drugs or something. There are a few that don't have either, because most women entering the trade do not actually have those problems at the time. They develop during the time that they are in the trade and are being exploited and abused, and they develop them, of course, as a survival strategy. But it all then becomes part of this highly complicating and charged, collection of problems they then have to solve. But I also remember the disability rights movement in Britain in the 1980s. I remember it very well indeed, and I remember this subject coming up. Women with disabilities really had to fight quite forcefully for the right. This was actually, I remember thinking, ooh, I didn't put that in my presentation. Actually, that's a classic example of a woman who actually perhaps more often than not, has to fight for the right to take a child to full term and give birth to that child and nurse it and raise it. It's a perfect example, so thank you very much indeed, actually, for raising this issue, because that has at least enabled me to bring in a piece that I would have very much wanted to mention. And yes, I do think, I really so well remember the kind of ferocious rows. I'm actually deaf, I use hearing aids. I wasn't particularly deaf then, but I did know it was coming down the rails. I used to help out at disability conferences a lot. I remember the ferocious arguments between various groups of disabled women. There were those who were like, no, I'm sorry, a woman's right to choose, this is an absolute red line for me. And if a woman is pregnant with a baby that has found to have a disability, or she believes is likely to have one, and she wants to abort it, I am going to defend her. I don't, whereas others were saying, no, it's eugenics. And I just used to find myself thinking, yeah, she's quite right. Oh shit, yeah, she's absolutely right. Oh, yeah, and I never, unfortunately, really arrived at a very proper, generally speaking, I think I have to defend the right of the woman to give birth, but equally, if somebody wants an abortion, I'm really not about to stand in her way. I'm just not. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite simply, a woman's womb is not a site for political debate. This has become a live issue.
A very, very good
recently, because in the UK, I think it might also be elsewhere, but particularly in the UK, there has been this new test developed. So previously, for women who what happens in pregnancy is early on you're tested with a blood test to see whether the pregnancy might be liable to have Down syndrome or other genetic defects. And if you're deemed to be high risk, then much later on in the pregnancy, when you're at 20, out there at 20 weeks, you have to have a test which is extremely invasive, where a needle is put into the amniotic fluid. It breaks the sort of protective sac, for lack of a better word, and it has a very high risk of miscarriage, and that's how they test for Down syndrome. And lots of women miscarried on the basis of that, whether the child had Down syndrome or not. And it's an incredibly invasive procedure that has now been, there is a new test now, which would be non-invasive, which would just involve blood tests and scans and things like that, which would tell you the same thing. Fantastic news. But disability activists are trying to get that banned in the UK because they say that if women, the majority of women who find out that they are carrying a pregnancy with Down syndrome will choose to have an abortion. Now, whatever you think about disability rights, and I'm sure most of us are very much in favour for a society which is as inclusive and respectful and celebratory of all kinds of people, whether they have Down syndrome or anything else, that decision and that political debate should not happen within the sight of a woman's body. And I'm horrified by people who are trying to masquerade an anti-choice position in terms of disability rights. It's really a kind of identity politics war happening in women's wombs. It's pretty vile. Pretty simply, I think it's always wrong to force a woman to have an abortion. It's also always wrong to force a woman to give birth. And that is the central position, no matter what the context. I think the two are equally bad, perhaps even actually, it's worse to force a woman to give birth because there is a child at the end of it and all the implications that has. But just as a tiny point, which is this idea of women being sacrificed for children, which is a tricky one, because obviously if you want to become a mother, you know that your life is going to change and you will gladly have to make sacrifices. Indeed, that happens throughout pregnancy. Of course, you can't drink. Everybody knows that. You can't smoke. I loved smoking and I gave it up. And when I was going through IVF treatment, and that was a sacrifice I willingly made. All those things, let's not be infantile about this. Sacrifices must be made. I'm not going to be going out, not that I ever really did, to clubs anymore when I have a baby, all these things. And I'm happy about that. But there is also this trend to really, to completely sacrifice women's lives and sense of themselves for the benefit of children, which is really prevalent at the moment. One of the key things that I've often get my knickers in a twist about is breastfeeding. Across the European Union and indeed pretty much across the world, the WHO has guidelines and rules that countries have adopted, laws which restrict the sale and the advertisement of formula milk, which is, you can raise a baby just fine on formula in the same way that you can raise a baby on breastfeeding. And the reason why they are pushing the issue of breastfeeding so heavily onto women is because, what happens when you breastfeed? You sacrifice your entire life. You are like a tap that is, has to be turned on at whatever hour of the day the baby needs it. And now some women love that, and that's wonderful and want to do it. Lots of women do not least because giving them a bottle means you can palm them off on dad for a while and go out and, see your friends or maybe see the daylight in the first few weeks of pregnancy. And so there is a general trend that actually, unfortunately, has been given this kind of progressive sheen. There's a lot of sort of contemporary feminist pro-motherhood, earth mother, blah, blah, blah kind of moves, which are really about rehabilitating this idea that women's function in society is raising the young. And obviously, we do it, and until we invent babies in bags, which, as it happens, I'm not particularly opposed to as a technological advancement, though it's sort of sci-fi at the moment rather than reality, that women are the ones who give birth, and that's why it's absurd that this kind of transgender trend has tried to change us from women and mothers into pregnant bodies and chest feeders. But please, that's not all we are. And indeed, that's not all we are once we get pregnant and give birth. And so there is, I think, you know, the whole question that you've brought up about what constitutes a good mother. A good mother has become incredibly oppressive for women's freedom at the moment, and it's something that doesn't often get challenged.
Great, thank you. I think that's a serious and very complex moral dilemma, which even I can't come to some sort of resolution on. Any more questions, please?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the presentation of different points of view of this important and difficult topic. And what I want to say is not maybe not a question or questions, but rather some remarks to what you said, especially what Ella said. First thing is a juridical remark, I think, because you were talking about the Polish law and these problems with changes in Polish law, and maybe I understood not correctly, but so maybe it is misunderstanding. But I think that there are two cases in Poland, according to the Polish law, when abortion is possible. One is where conception is the result of the rape. So this is then in this case abortion is possible. And another second one is when the pregnancy is probably the danger for the woman's life. Not surely, but only it is enough for doctor to say that it is probability that it could be danger for the health of the woman. So there are two, in fact, possibilities to do abortion, not only this one with the rape. Yes, so and there was third the abortion from the social reason. Yes, there was a third possibility, and it was. And there was another when there was a probability that, when it would that the child is disabled, or it could be, it could have the Down syndrome. So it was removed from the law. So so this is the Polish law. And another remark. I think you said, Ella said that the right to abortion is the crucial dimension of the freedom, of the human freedom, the right to decision, to choice, right to choice. In fact, it is the essential freedom. And another, next question is next problem or is. Next thesis, in fact, was that abortion is the deeply human thing. It is what this is the difference between the animals and the human. That the human being could make a decision and abort a child or stop the pregnancy. And I think that I can agree with this because. Yes, this is true. This is the freedom to choose, but it is not the whole problem. It is the part. It is the part of the problem, because the decision, the right decision, could be made when you know all the circumstances. So you can divide the decision from the knowledge, from the truth. In fact, the good decision or freedom has to be connected with the truth, in my opinion. So what is the result of the decision? It is to stop somebody's lives, in fact, because the unborn, before the birth, it is the human being, yes? It is on some early stage. Maybe it looks differently than the human being after birth. But it is, in fact, the human being. Yes, it is separate human being. It is not the part of the woman's body. So the decision, yes, this is the freedom. This is the freedom of decision to stop its life or to give a chance to continue this life. So this is the decision, to stop life and to give chance to continue life. And this is freedom. I agree with you. This is the freedom. And the next thing, yes, it is deeply human. It is deeply human because only human being can do something, something like this, to stop somebody's life, yes, with such a reason, because it is the question of freedom, or from such a based on the of such a thinking, yes. Not I think that the animals, of course, they do this, like they stop other lives, but with some different reason. So I agree. This is to conclude. I think that the only human being could be so cruel to do this. This is my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes, so I'm going to give each of my guests about 1 minute to maybe respond to that final comment or anything else that you feel you want to raise. So start with Claudia, and then Ella, Nina, and finally Agnieszka.
Okay. I think essentially I take the view that the right to choose to terminate a pregnancy, the woman's right to choose to terminate the pregnancy, that from, you know, I said it in the paper, it is a fundamental. Once you lose that, it's fundamental to equality between the sexes, really. If you seek equality, that choice about whether or not to take a pregnancy to full term it's fundamental. I mean, I think we're going to see this in the United States. It's going to be an uphill task trying to get that back. I really do. And I think the issue is, yes, you are terminating a living organism. I don't have the expertise to sort of establish exactly at what point human life, as I think of it, begins. But it seems to me that certainly, I think is it 12 weeks in the UK? What's the, or? 24, yeah. Right. I really wouldn't want it to be reduced. It's already, I mean, Ella said relatively easy to get an abortion, and I think it is relative. It's not that easy. I mean, certainly when I got an abortion, I really might not have got that abortion. I really, really might not. And although, you also remarked that at the end of an unwanted pregnancy, there is a child with and another human being with all the, it is an incredibly complicated issue to solve. I mean, there are babies born of rape who are glad to be alive. There are others who have had to really struggle, and indeed several, some who have brought, one in particular, who actually campaigned to bring the rapist to justice, even though she was the result of that rape. So it's, yeah, I mean, I can't go without, I've got to keep, I am going to keep this red line that abortion is a woman's right to choose.
Okay. The question, I think the pro-choice side has for too long played down the significance of life and the wonder of conception and human life. And I don't want to deny that at all. I mean, because I had IVF, I saw scans of my pregnancy from stupidly early, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks. And it's funny how emotional you can get about a microscopic bleeping little dot on a screen. And for women who have wanted pregnancies, who are looking forward to the journey of raising a child, the philosophical, emotional value that you attach to that life that's growing inside you is magnanimous. It's huge. It's wonderful. But that is not the same, and that is that value and that attachment completely changes when you are a woman who does not want to be pregnant. And the reason why it doesn't, the actual physical, medical, biological reality of at what point, things start to become aware, or at what point, fetal viability is changing. Okay, is changing. In terms of, it used to be 28 weeks. We thought now babies are surviving at 24 weeks or earlier, and that's a fantastic thing if it's a baby that you want. But I think that the difference is you don't deny the significance and wonder of life, but you say that what's more important than the potential for life is the life that is there. That's the woman. And yes, it's a thing it is part of her body. It's this thing cannot exist outside of me at the moment. It is my body. But I think more important is the weighing up, making a decision. Which is more important, the potential for life, which we don't know anything about yet, or the citizen, the woman who is an individual in society right now with rights and values and a voice? And I think, with the pro-choice side, have to be honest in saying we are making a value judgment, and we are not saying that there's nothing to lose. I hate that phrase, it's just a clump of cells, that some pro-choicers use. That's not true at all. There is value in it, but you're making a value judgment, and freedom is the value judgment. And so I don't think we should be flippant about this, but it's to say that it makes it all the more powerful to me to say that the most important thing is the woman. And many women have different feelings about their abortions. Some of them regret it, some of them are delighted they made that decision. But most important was that their ability to make that decision. And I think that should be always at the top priority.
Thanks.
Okay, just extremely
Very quickly, yes.
Yeah. Well, I think we have an interesting opportunity for all of us to rethink our values at the level of what sex is, who we're having sex with and why, and for what reasons, and how we give respect to ourselves, to men and women equally, actually, and to think about what kind of culture and what kind of society we are bringing into existence, let's say.
I'm very happy that we managed to have this conversation, that we went beyond the social media, black and white, emotional meltdowns, and also that we avoided getting into political games and manipulation, because that's another issue that is in the background of this theme. So I thank you all for coming, being guests, taking part, keeping your cool, and I hope we work in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone here. Very important debate, and it was great to hear so many different perspectives. We are running over time, so I just want to thank our wonderful translators, Sophia and Piotr, who's done a sterling job of translating this 2-hour conversation. I'd like to thank the directors, Piotr, Beata, and Marcel, for giving us the opportunity to have these very salient, important debates. Our production coordinators, Anka and Anna, who organised everything to get us here and to look after us and book hotels and taxis. Thank you both for doing that. And our partners, who are we're delighted to have on board the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is run by the Academy of Ideas. Do come to their festival in London in the autumn. It's fantastic. And there's a plethora of conversations and debates from different perspectives. I'd like to thank the discussion program, Enea, who has a fantastic discussion series on GB News every Sunday from 3 to 4. They have recently come on as a media partner. So we hope that at the next discussion, Culture Tensions discussion, another very topical subject on the European Union. And I think in light of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that's going to be another perspective that we will consider when we discuss whether it's a benevolent, supranational, or another form of a superstate. So we have two fantastic speakers confirmed: Professor Frank Furedi, Professor of Sociology, and Director of the Royal Academy, probably speaking in a personal capacity. She's Director of Architecture, Vicky Richardson, and a third one to be confirmed. So please come in July, and there'll be another robust and vociferously passionate debate, I hope. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to everyone online in Poland, in UK, and beyond via YouTube. Keep in touch. Get on the mailing list of the fantastic Ujazdowski, still can't pronounce the name well, Ujazdowski Castle Centre for Contemporary Art. There's nothing else, to my knowledge, going on in terms of free-thinking exhibitions and debates in Europe and beyond. Thank you.